The 2025 Sew Sampler Box Quilt Along is going on. We're in month 3, which came in June's box, June 2025. It's called Flowering, and we're on block 3. This is my patriotic theme quilt. I'm making a scrappy patriotic Americana version of it, but I'm also making some from my fig tree scraps, mostly my fig tree scraps with a few others added in. So here's block 3 already made for my Americana fabrics. And that's probably mostly Lori Holt. And now I'm going to make my scrappy fig tree, mostly fig tree fabrics, block number 3, and you can come along and watch. Come along and maybe you'll pick up some tips, maybe you'll learn from some mistakes I make, because I do make them. But come along and join me. Let's get started. I've got my instructions handy so I can keep an eye on those. I especially like looking at the diagrams they draw to make sure I have everything laid out in the proper direction. Our first part of the process will be to sew our flying geese. I'm not making flying geese according to the instructions. I'm going to use this foundation paper. So you'll get to watch me do that. And if you've never used foundation paper, you might learn some things, or you might figure out that you don't want to learn about it. For the flying geese, I'll need 2 pieces, because each page makes 2 flying geese. And this is from the That Quarter Shop is their product. Love it. I will set my stitch length smaller than normal. It's going to be under 2 at least, so my paper tears more easily and my stitches hold together well. I've got the center for my flying geese, and typically I would put a little glue there to hold it down, but with this particular size I don't feel the need for that. So I'm going to position my paper to make sure that it goes over each line at least 1/4 of an inch. I want to make sure I have at least 1/4 of an inch there to allow for my seam allowance, because if not, my seam won't hold up. But you first position your number 1 paper. Your number 1 fabric. My number 1 fabric is the center, and this is what I've chosen. So I hold it up to the light, and I can see that I've got well over 1/4 of an inch past each number 1 line. So I'm good there. Then I need to use the fabric that I'm going to have for number 2 and 3, which is my outer edges of the flying geese. And I'll hold it up to a light source to make sure that I position it at least 1/4 of an inch. And I'm eyeballing it, I don't have to measure it. 1/4 of an inch over the line that connects 1 and 2. So I've got my number 1 fabric back there. I've got my number 2 fabric back there. This line here is where I'm going to stitch. I want to make sure that my fabric is going over that line at least 1/4 of an inch. So I'll have that 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'll have that room there. And your fabric needs to be right sides together. The first piece you lay down will be right side up. So I've got my number 1 right side up, my number 2 right side down, which means right sides are together. This fabric here is allowing for 1/4 of an inch over my seam line, and I'm going to get started. I'm going to begin a stitch or 2 before my seam line and end a stitch or 2 after. I just find that that secures my stitch the way I like it to be. And I'll stitch directly onto the line. I've stitched there. Now what I want to do is fold my paper along my stitch line. So I'm going to fold my paper back along my stitch line so I get a crease. And then I'm going to fold it forward. So now I can see my stitch line and where I've folded it, because I'm getting ready to trim to make a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I don't want to trim my paper. I don't want to trim the wrong edges of my fabric. I just want to make sure I'll be trimming my seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. See how I've got my seam line here, my fabric, then the seam allowance. I folded it on this line where I stitched, folded it down. And at this point, I want to trim this up so it's just a 1/4 inch. There's lots of ways people do this, but I choose to do this method. Some people like their fabric trimmed precisely before they start stitching it down. Okay, see roughly, I've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I fold that back. Next, I want to use my seam roller, and I'm going to roll it over here to press this seam down. You don't want to use heat yet because it can sometimes distort your paper, and then you may be off in your size of your flying geese. Got my seam laid open the way it would be if I was getting ready to trim it down. Let's see, got it open. Then right across the seam, I'm just going to roll. Get a good crease in there. Now at this point, I can go to the other block and do number 2, my fabric number 2 here, just like I did my fabric number 2 over here. Or I can go to number 3 here and finish this flying goose. But I always want to go in order, 1, 2, 3, for each flying goose, flying geese. So I never want to stitch down piece 3 and then piece 2, because where the points cross, it'll not be consistent with all your flying geese. Some will cross left to right, some will cross right to left. So, but if that's not important to you, you do you. So I'm going to go ahead and do my other number 2. Got my fabric. I'm going to hold it up to a light source to make sure I can see that I'm getting at least a 1/4 inch over that line on number 2. Number 2. And I am. And I can tell I'm over the line at least a 1/4 inch because of the way the light's shining. I'm not sure you'll be able to see, but when the light shines through here, I can see my fabric is at least a 1/4 inch above this line between 1 and 2. So now I'm going to stitch it down just like I did the other one, and I'll do 3 next, and then I'll come back and show you what it looks like and we'll trim it up. I have all my pieces added now. Doesn't look like a flying goose, does it? But I've got them all stitched down. And now what I'm going to do is trim among the solid outer lines of each flying goose. So I'm going to just trim out the rectangle shape, and we're going to see how it shapes up. I do have one more to make because I need I need 4 flying geese. Each paper makes 2. So I have to do 2 of these papers. So I'm going to do the other paper, and then I'll be back to trim them up and press and show you. Side note here, if you don't have a seam roller, that's okay. I like this one from Lori Holt. If you don't have that, finger pressing it is okay. Or get creative. You might have something around the house you can use to just kind of press that down. The first one I made exactly as I showed y'all. I trimmed my edges each time I stitched one. I trimmed the seam allowance to a 1/4 inch roughly. I seam rolled the sewn pieces, and it's ready to trim. The second one I made, I just finger pressed my seams, and I didn't trim my edges. It'll all be caught when I go around and trim, and what's not, I'll go back and trim the 1/4 inch just to show you foundation paper piecing isn't as hard as you may think it is. All right, the first one is where I've trimmed my seam allowance already as I sewed along. I want to trim along the solid line of each flying goose. That will give me the exact size that I need for my pattern, the exact size unfinished that the flying geese paper says it will be. To make things easier, of course, I'm going to use a ruler to keep my hands steady. And I want to cut right on the line, but I tell you what I do, I actually cut a smidgen, not even a scant, just slightly over the line just to make sure. I'd rather have it a little wiggle room. I don't trust myself to get it right on the line. And I make sure nothing's balled up underneath because I don't want to cut fabric that shouldn't be cut, or have a piece of balled up fabric under there. I am saving most of these for a perm quilt. Okay, so far I've trimmed it pretty well. Then I've got to trim the bottom. This is what it looks like so far. Almost looks like a square and a square, but not quite. What I like to do is give these a good press with the paper on, and it actually helps the paper come off better. But I'm going to put that to the side. This is the second one that I told you I didn't do any of the trimming on the seam allowance. Didn't do any of the folding. So what I'm going to do, I did finger pressing. I'm still going to trim it the same way we just trimmed the other one, as far as along the edges. And you can turn your sewing mat, or you can turn your fabric, it doesn't matter. If I wanted to leave that stable, I could just swing it around. Okay, this cleaned it up for the most part, but you can see I've still left some pretty sizable seam allowance there. So now I'm going to just break out my scissors and trim it down, eyeball it to a 1/4 inch. Do that to both pieces. make sure you don't get your actual fabric that you need to retain in your seam allowance. I have done that and I had to do it over. So just be careful when you trimming with foundation paper, regardless of how you trim. You don't want to catch the wrong pieces of fabric in your trim down. All right, I'm going to press these and then I'm going to remove the paper. I have pressed. Now all I've got to do is take off my paper. You can fold it along the seams and tear it or find whatever works for you. Don't let anyone try to be your quilt police. We're all just sharing tips that works for us, and if it works for you, hey, great, use them. If it doesn't work for you, find what works for you. No. See? Perfect flying geese. So I want to try the 4 at a time method using the flying geese ruler. I would like to try that. I have my 4 flying geese. Moving right along. Oh, this month's pattern is called Stop and Smell the Roses of the flowering Quilty. Stop and smell the roses. All right, next section is to make the center of the rose. And that sort of reminds me of a square in a square. Got our flying geese that we're going to use for it. Get my design board. I need pieces F and A along with my flying geese. So I have F and A, my flying geese. I did cut my pieces F 1/4 of an inch larger, and I'm going to trim them down. They are in the corners of this block, and you'll see where they kind of overhang, but it just helps me to have a more consistent size of my block. Because I cut my corners larger, when I stitch these together, I want to make sure that when I stitch my first row together, that the overhang is at the top here, or else the purpose for having these is defeated. Because when I trim, I'm going to go trim on the outer edge, so my overhang needs to be on the outer edges. Same thing here. When I stitch this together, I want the longer piece, the overhang, to be on the outside. The center doesn't have any overhang because it's flying geese. It's just wherever I have to sew in a corner square. Okay, so what I'm going to do is stitch 1, 2, 3 together. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Once those are stitched together, pressed and cooled using my clappers, I'm going to stitch row 1 to row 2, and then all of that will be stitched to row 3. Press and cool. Then once it's cool and the center block is complete, I will trim it down according to the measurements, and you'll come along for the ride. I'll show you. So let's get these pieces stitched together. If you have a recommendation for lighting, I'd love to know about it. And lighting that won't break the bank too. I've got my eye on the Stella lamp. It's a little pricey, but I know it's worth it, but I'm not sure I want to invest that much yet. So let me know your thoughts and your recommendations. Now you'll see what I mean by the overhang. That's my bottom piece. I'm going to stitch my middle. and then my top. And I made an oops. I'm going to undo that with my seam ripper. It's because I was not paying attention, evidently. Got it this time. Making sure I get the overhang on the outer edge when I'm piecing this one together. Now I'm going to set the seam, press, and let these cool. Okay, while those are cooling, I can work on D and H. These get a corner square on each end. Now the directions want us to go diagonal like this and diagonal like this. So it's important that you do that, because if you go the same direction, like if I go from bottom left to upper right, bottom left to upper right, the direction will be parallel. Parallel. Oh, that's a hard word for me to say. This design has a larger bottom edge, smaller upper edge. So on one side, we're going left to right, or from the outer to the inner edge. And on the other side, we're going right to left, from the outer to the inner edge. You can mark the center line to sew on, or you can use seam guide tape. Some people eyeball it. I don't recommend that if you're not at least an intermediate quilt piecer. I'm going to use my seam guide tape. I'm going to go from the inner edge to the outer edge, but I am going to go a scant seam, so it makes allowance for the corner square being folded over. I just have better results that way. And if you're not sure what to do, practice. See what works best for you. It depends on a lot. It depends on the thickness of your fabric, the thickness of your thread. It depends on your stitch length. A lot of variables there. And look what I did. See? I went in the wrong direction because I obviously cannot talk and sew at the same time. Maybe my channel needs to be called What Not to Do in Quilting. I get so engaged in what I'm talking about, I don't pay attention to what I'm actually doing. That's all right. It's an easy fix. You can chain piece these if you want to. Do them all at one time. Here we go. And if you feel good about it, you can trim more than one piece at a time. Depends on how well your scissors trim. You could put these down and trim it with your rotary cutter. You know, whatever works for you. once I trim all of these. I'm going to set the seam. That's just placing the iron on top of the seam for like 3 seconds or so. It helps to press that seam down and lock it in. It'll help your seam stay straight. And once it's set, then I will press it in the direction that the instructions tell me to. I can't do anything with these this small. These are like 1.5 inches square, but it's cut in half, so maybe what's 3/4? But if you know of something I can do with them, tell me and I'll start saving them and do it eventually, like in a million years. Okay, set the seam, press according to the directions. Which of you are doing the Sew Sampler box sew along? You don't really have to even get the box to do the sew along. You can order the patterns from that quarter shop, and I think you can even do it as a PDF download. I know you can buy the little paper instructions they'll mail to you. I want to say they're around $4 or $5. So if you don't want to order the Sew Sampler box, you can still participate in the sew along and just order the pattern. Now that the pieces we created have cooled, we're going to put this together. The center of the rose, stitch together like that. What I'll do is pin 1 and 2, stitch it, then pin 2 and 3 and stitch it, press, let it cool, and trim it. I do need to match up my seams here and here, here and here, here and here, here and here. These seams should nest. And since this seam's to the right, this seam's to the left, I can nest those together. They bump up against each other and kind of lock in. I will pin it so it stays secure while I'm stitching it down. And I think I'll go ahead and pin the bottom. So as soon as I stitch this, I can turn around and stitch the bottom. Nesting my seams again. Pin that. I don't want to stretch it, but as I sew, I can kind of make sure it feeds well into there. If you have some you need to ease into your seam, the part that has the fabric that's got to be eased into there, put that on the bottom so your feed dogs will help you ease that in. So let's try that. See, it laid right down. No wrinkles, no more pleats. And I didn't have to pull or tug, it just kind of, the feed dogs helped guide it right in there. My points aren't perfect there, but I'm okay with them. I'm pleased with how they turned out. I'm not looking for perfection. I'm just looking for what I'm comfortable with and what I like. I'm going to set my seam, press, and let these cool. Remember these pieces we did? We have larger pieces to do the same way. So for these, since they were larger, I drew my line from inner to outer and stitched just a thread or two scant from that line. That just works better for me. I've done one side, now I need to flip them and do the other side. Making sure that I have the lines from the outer edge to the inner edge on both sides. Not going to break my thread because I'm chain piecing these. I'll break my thread at the end. Make sure all of them are stitched in the correct directions at each end. Yay, they are. Now I'm going to trim off the excess to where I only have a 1/4 inch seam. I have a ruler that's the same size as what the instructions say this block needs to be. If you don't, that's okay. You can use any ruler that's got the markings. It's just you may have to do it a little bit different. If all you have is a straight edge ruler, then do one edge at a time. And you may want to say, for example, if this needs to be, I don't know, 10 inches, then you know the center's at 5. So you could take a ruler and make sure that 5 inches from the center is marked. And that's what you would trim off, anything greater than 5 inches. You just have to think through the, I guess, the geometry of it, would it be? Okay, so let's trim this one up. I have a ruler that's the same size as my block, but if not, as I explained earlier, you would need to understand what the size needs to be and find the center and trim each side. I'm going to use my lines on this Creative Grids ruler to make sure the center is set. This ruler has white lines in the center that I match up with the center of the flying geese. I also want to make sure, especially on my flying geese, that I'm allowing a 1/4 inch seam allowance so it doesn't cut into the points at the top of my flying geese. So that's another way I can align my ruler. And I try and hold my ruler as best I can so it doesn't move on me. This one doesn't have any grips that I've added to it, but I do add grips to some of my rulers. The Creative Grids rulers have a little bit of traction or resistance on them. There's like a little bit of a frosting on some of the circles. But I still like to add little rubber pieces. They're flat, but they help with the sliding. Now, there's my block. Isn't it pretty? I like that a lot. I tried to make this one a little fussy cut. Made it diagonal and wanted to get that herb in there. The next step is to add these pieces. Now do you see why it was important to make sure I had these going in the same direction? If not, they would have been more parallel than, I guess, going to look like they're going to intersect. Ugh, geometry days are coming back. So that's what I'm going to do there. I need my corner pieces, and I believe I cut those a little larger as well to aid in trimming down. Is so 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Then we'll sew row 1 to the center and the bottom row to the center. And again, I want to make sure my excess is at the outer edges. So when I trim it up, I can make sure that that's to my advantage. And as I put these down, I keep thinking through, where does it need to lay? If it's the excess of that corner square needs to be on the outer edge. I have to keep reminding myself so I don't place it incorrectly. Now I will set the seam and press these. And I'll also stitch these, set the seam and press. This does not have seams to line up right here, so that's good. I do think I'm going to pin it. That'll just help me keep my seams laid down. Okay, I'm going to set the seam press, let these cool, and get my other items off the ironing table. I do have two seams to match here, these seams to these, but they'll nest, and I'll pin them. Okay, it's time for the final ring of rosies. These are the last rows of petals we'll have. We're going to use pieces G as our corner squares, and I believe I've cut these oversized. And it's pretty much just a repeat of the last ring around the rosy that we did. I'm going to piece together these corner squares on each end of the top and bottom. Then sew the top to the middle, the bottom to the middle, and trim it up. Now we'll flip it around and sew the corner square to the other end. Then set the seam and press. I'm waiting for some pieces to cool, so I'm going to go ahead and put together the borders. I did cut them about a 1/2 inch wider, as well as the corner squares. It's time to trim down our center of the rose, and I'm going to line up the ruler lines along the seam lines. I'm looking and measuring the width of my pieces to make sure they line up with what my directions say it should be. And here I am looking to just get as straight an edge as possible without cutting into seam allowance. I'm measuring both ways to make sure the width and the length of my square is actually square, and if it's not, I'll shape it up the best I can. But remember, we're not aiming for perfection. We're just aiming for what works for us, what's pleasing to us. You're the boss of your own quilt. Time to sew on those outer petals, our final ring around the rosies before we add the border. I'm pinning our side petals. We'll get these stitched down, press, let it cool, and then our final petals, the top and bottom, with the corner squares that we made. Time for the top and bottom petals that have the corner squares. Once we get these pinned and sewn on, pressed and cooled, then we'll trim this block up and be ready to put the final touches on it, which is, this one has a border. We're so close to being finished now. Very large block. But I like large blocks like this. To me, they may have lots of steps or pieces, but working with larger pieces for me is easier. We are ready to put on the borders. Here is our yellow ring around the rosy. We'll have to match just that one seam in each corner. That should be fairly simple. I did cut these about a 1/2 inch wider for my cornerstone and my strip, just so in the end, when we do that final trim down, I can have my block as accurate as possible according to the final unfinished size. I believe is a 18.5 inch square. It also helps me square up the block and allow for any of the wonkiness that has accumulated. It's a wonky world, and I'm a wonky girl making quilts. As I was putting this together here at the end, I did eyeball it, look at all the pieces, and make sure they're in the right direction. I try to do that as often as possible when I'm stitching it together, because I don't want to get it quilted and then see a piece turned the wrong way. So at ever so many stages of the process, I'll pause and take time to look at all the pieces, check them out, make sure they don't need me to bring out the seam ripper. We made it, y'all. We made it to the end. We've got everything sewn together, and this is the final check to shape up the block. I am looking at the seam allowance on the outer edge, considering how much I need to trim it down. For example, if I cut those pieces 4 inches and the instructions says for it to be 3 inches, then I know I've got an inch of wiggle room. But I won't be trimming off a whole inch because my block is a little wonky and I've got to square it up. I need to account for the 1/4 inch that's already been taken. So in the example, if the directions call for a 3 inch strip, I cut it 4 inches and I've now taken a 1/4 inch seam. That strip right now from the seam to the outer edge should measure 2 3/4 inches. So I would be measuring from the seam out 2 3/4 inches to make sure I cut it to what the finished instructions say. You may notice some of the strips I cut off are not consistently even. It may start out being a 1/4 of an inch wide, and then by the time I'm finished cutting it, it's narrowed it down to just a little teeny tiny piece. This is where these borders help me to square up my block. And once it's in the quilt and quilted, no one's going to notice. So stop stressing over your blocks not being the perfect size according to the directions. They rarely turn out to be the perfect size unless you are a master quilter, and even those folks have tips and tricks to make it work. Don't let quilting become something that causes you stress and anxiety. The whole point of quilting for me is to have something that I enjoy and have a creative outlet. And if I start putting stress on myself about it, I'm not going to want to do it. I've found that's what happens in my other hobbies I've tried. Okay, here you're going to see me fold it in half, and I'm just doing that to make sure that it is square for the most part from top to bottom. By doing this, I can tell if the top and bottom are off a significant amount from each other. Here it is. Final Ring Around the Rosie. It's done. I love it. I wouldn't mind having a whole quilt of this exact flower and color. When I first saw the pattern, I loved it, and as I started making it, I wasn't so sure. It was like a hate-love relationship, and now that it's finished, I love it. Tell me what you thought of this in your comments. Are you making the Ring Around the Rosie for the Fat Quarter Shop 2025 Sew Sampler Quilt Along? Hope you have some fun and relaxing, happy quilty days.